The last thing Lucas Montgomery expected when he walked into his father's study that evening was to have his entire future mapped out for him, and not by choice. "You're getting married," his father said, the words slicing through the room like a whip. Lucas froze mid-step, his piercing blue eyes narrowing in disbelief. "Excuse me, married to whom? And why on earth would I agree to something so archaic?" He leaned against the edge of the mahogany desk, his tailored suit pristine, his jaw clenched in defiance. Howard Montgomery, a man whose presence alone could command a room, steepled his fingers and met his son's glare with calm authority. "Her name is Charlotte Bennett. Her father owns Bennett International and our merger depends on this union. It's already been decided." Lucas laughed, but it was hollow, bitter. "You're joking." "Please tell me you're joking." "I've never been more serious," his father replied, his voice cold as steel. "This marriage isn't just about business, Lucas, it's about legacy. Our family's future." Lucas pushed off the desk, pacing the room like a caged lion. At 28, he was already a self-made millionaire, having built his own tech firm from the ground up. He didn't need his father's wealth or influence. But Howard Montgomery had a way of making even the most independent man feel like a rebellious teenager. "I don't even know her," Lucas protested, his voice rising. "What am I supposed to do? Walk down the aisle with a stranger and pretend this is normal? You'll get to know her," his father said dismissively, waving a hand. "She's suitable, polished, comes from a good family. And from what I hear, she's beautiful. You'll have no reason to complain." Lucas felt the walls closing in. He'd always vowed that if he ever married, it would be for love, something real, something meaningful. Not this cold, calculated transaction his father was proposing. "I won't do it," he said firmly, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they didn't carry weight. His father's influence was too vast, his power too suffocating. "You will." "The wedding is in 3 months," Howard said, standing up and smoothing his tie as if the conversation were already over. "And Lucas." "Don't embarrass me." Charlotte Bennett stood in front of the mirror, her fingers gripping the edge of the vanity as she stared at her reflection. Her stepmother, Margaret, flitted around her bedroom, adjusting the hem of Charlotte's dress and chattering like a bird. "This is a wonderful opportunity for you, Charlotte," Margaret said, her saccharine tone grating. "Lucas Montgomery is incredibly wealthy and comes from an excellent family. You'll be set for life." Charlotte turned to face her, her green eyes blazing. "I'm not some commodity to be traded for business deals, Margaret. I'm a person." Margaret sighed dramatically, her perfectly coiffed hair barely moving. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. You should be grateful. Girls would kill to be in your position. Grateful." Charlotte wanted to scream. She'd spent her entire life under the thumb of her father and stepmother, her dreams of becoming an artist stifled in favor of family obligations. And now, this an arranged marriage to a man she'd never met. "I don't even know him," Charlotte said, crossing her arms. "What if he's awful? What if he's unkind?" Margaret waved her concerns away. "He's rich and handsome. That's all that matters." Charlotte turned back to the mirror, her heart sinking. She'd seen photos of Lucas Montgomery on the internet. He was undeniably attractive, with a sharp jawline, dark hair, and those piercing eyes that seemed to see through you. But a photograph was no indication of who he truly was. For all she knew, he could be cold, arrogant, or worse, completely indifferent. The first time they met was at an upscale restaurant in Manhattan, a neutral territory chosen by their families. Lucas arrived first, dressed impeccably in a navy suit, his expression unreadable. He ordered a scotch and sat at the corner table, his mind racing. When Charlotte walked in, he almost didn't recognize her from the photos. She was breathtaking. Her wavy auburn hair fell over her shoulders, and she wore a simple yet elegant black dress that hugged her figure without trying too hard. But it wasn't her appearance that caught him off guard, it was the way she carried herself. She didn't look nervous or eager to please. If anything, she looked annoyed. "Lucas Montgomery?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. He stood, offering a polite smile and extending his hand. "Charlotte Bennett, I presume?" She shook his hand, her grip firm, her green eyes scanning his face as if she were trying to figure him out. "This is absurd, isn't it?" she said as she slid into the seat across from him. He chuckled, surprised by her candor. "Completely." "I'm guessing you're not thrilled about this either." "Not in the slightest," she admitted, picking up the menu. "But here we are." They ordered their meals, the conversation stilted and polite at first. But as the evening wore on, Lucas found himself relaxing in her presence. Charlotte was witty, sharp, and unafraid to speak her mind. She told him about her love for painting, her dreams of opening an art gallery someday, and her frustration with the constraints of her family's expectations. Lucas listened intently, his own walls slowly crumbling. He told her about his tech company, his struggles to prove himself outside of his father's shadow, and his own reluctance about the marriage. "Looks like we're both prisoners in this arrangement," Charlotte said with a wry smile. "Prisoners," he echoed, raising his glass. "Here's to being cellmates." She laughed, a sound that was warm and genuine, and for the first time that night, Lucas felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. As the dinner ended, they stepped outside into the cool night air. Lucas turned to her, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Charlotte, I know this isn't ideal, but maybe we can make the best of it, at least try to be friends." She looked up at him, her expression softening. "Friends," she repeated. "I think I can manage that." But as they stood there under the city lights, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that this woman, this stranger he was being forced to marry, might just be the one person capable of turning his carefully controlled world upside down. The wedding date loomed closer like an inevitable storm, and despite their initial efforts to remain friendly cellmates, Lucas and Charlotte avoided each other as much as possible. Their families orchestrated the details with military precision, leaving them little room to protest. Invitations were sent, venues booked, and Charlotte found herself subjected to endless fittings for a dress she wasn't even sure she wanted to wear. It wasn't until 2 weeks before the wedding that Lucas showed up unannounced at her family's estate. Charlotte was in the garden, her hands smeared with dirt as she knelt by a row of hydrangeas. Gardening was her escape, one of the few moments she could claim as entirely her own. She didn't hear him approach until his shadow cast over her. "You're surprisingly hard to track down," Lucas said, his deep voice startling her. Charlotte looked up, squinting against the sun. He stood there in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his navy trousers tailored to perfection. Even in the informal setting, he looked every bit the polished millionaire. "You found me," she said, brushing her hands off on her apron as she stood. "What are you doing here?" "I figured it was time we talked," he said, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers. Away from the watchful eyes of our parents, Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "And what do you want to talk about, Lucas?" "The color scheme for the wedding." "Or maybe how we're both being railroaded into this circus," he smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I was thinking more along the lines of making a deal." "A deal," she repeated, crossing her arms. "How very businesslike of you." "It's what I do," he said with a shrug. "Look, we both know this marriage is a transaction to our families, but it doesn't have to be miserable. I propose we set some ground rules." Charlotte tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. "I'm listening." "For starters," Lucas began, stepping closer, "we don't let them control us after the wedding. We present the united front they want, but behind closed doors, we live our lives the way we want. You can keep painting, start your gallery, whatever makes you happy. And I'll focus on my company without interference." "And what about us?" she asked, her voice softer now. "What do we do about this?" Marriage, Lucas hesitated, his jaw tightening. We figure it out as we go. No pressure, no expectations, just coexistence. Charlotte studied him for a long moment. There was something honest in his tone, a vulnerability he was trying to mask. For all his confidence and charm, Lucas Montgomery wasn't as impenetrable as he appeared. "All right," she said finally, "but I have a condition." "Let's hear it," he said. "If we're going to do this, we have to be honest with each other. No pretending, no games. If something's bothering you, say it. Deal?" He extended his hand, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Deal?" As their hands clasped, a jolt of something unspoken passed between them. Charlotte pulled away quickly, brushing her hair behind her ear as if to shake off the moment. "Is that all?" she asked, her voice tinged with forced casualness. "For now," Lucas said, his gaze lingering on her, "but I'll be back to see you before the big day. We should at least try to get to know each other a little better." She nodded, watching as he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing down the garden path. For the first time since their engagement was announced, Charlotte felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wouldn't be a complete disaster. True to his word, Lucas began visiting her regularly in the days leading up to the wedding. The first few meetings were awkward, stiff conversations over coffee or strained silences as they walked through the gardens. But slowly, hesitantly, they began to open up. Lucas surprised her one afternoon by showing up with a small, wrapped package. He handed it to her without ceremony, looking almost sheepish. "What's this?" she asked, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a set of high-quality paints and brushes, the kind she'd always dreamed of owning but couldn't justify buying. Charlotte's breath caught as she ran her fingers over the smooth wooden handles. "You mentioned wanting to paint more," Lucas said, his hands in his pockets. "I thought this might help." She looked up at him, her heart unexpectedly full. "Thank you," she said softly. "This means a lot." "It's nothing," he said, but the way he avoided her gaze told her otherwise. As the days passed, Charlotte began to see glimpses of the man behind the polished exterior. Lucas was thoughtful in ways she hadn't expected, remembering little things she mentioned and surprising her with small gestures. He had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and a quiet determination that mirrored her own. For his part, Lucas found himself drawn to Charlotte's unfiltered honesty. She didn't shy away from calling him out or challenging his ideas, and he realized he respected her for it. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, fiercely independent, yet deeply compassionate. Their friendship deepened, and with it came a growing tension neither of them wanted to acknowledge. It was in the way their conversations lingered, the way their eyes met and held for just a moment too long. It was in the accidental brushes of their hands, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them. The night before the wedding, Lucas found himself standing outside Charlotte's door, debating whether to knock. He wasn't sure what had brought him there, maybe nerves, maybe something else entirely. Before he could decide, the door opened and Charlotte stood there in a simple robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She blinked in surprise. "Lucas." "What are you doing here?" "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I guess I just wanted to see you." She stepped aside, letting him in. The room was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and an easel set up in the corner. A half-finished painting rested on it, the strokes bold and full of emotion. "You're really good," Lucas said, nodding toward the painting. "Thanks," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "So, what's on your mind?" He hesitated, then sat beside her. "I just wanted to say, if I haven't been clear, I'm sorry you're stuck in this situation. You deserve better." Charlotte looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Lucas, you're not as bad as you think you are, and maybe this isn't as awful as we thought it would be." Their eyes locked, and the air seemed to shift. Lucas reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his hand lingering for a moment. You're amazing, you know that, he said softly. Charlotte's breath hitched, but before she could respond, he stood abruptly, as if the moment had scared him. "Good night, Charlotte," he said, his voice tight. "Good night, Lucas," she whispered, watching as he walked out the door. As she lay in bed that night, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had changed. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if it terrified her or thrilled her. The wedding was a whirlwind of opulence, a spectacle orchestrated by their families to impress and intimidate. The ceremony took place on the sprawling grounds of Lucas's family estate, a historic mansion with towering columns and manicured gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly. White roses adorned every surface, crystal chandeliers sparkled under the crimson sunset, and an orchestra played softly in the background. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly surreal. Charlotte stood in the bridal suite, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The dress, a masterpiece of lace and silk, fit her perfectly, the intricate beadwork catching the light in a way that made her look almost ethereal. But no amount of tailoring or expensive fabric could quiet the storm raging in her chest. Her stepsister, Lily, adjusted Charlotte's veil with a grin. "You look like a queen," she said, stepping back to admire her work. Charlotte gave a small, tight smile. "I feel like a pawn." Lily hesitated, her expression softening. "It's going to be okay, Charlotte. Lucas doesn't seem like the worst guy in the world, and who knows, maybe this will work out." Charlotte didn't answer. She didn't trust her voice not to crack. Instead, she smoothed her hands over the fabric of her dress and took a deep breath. The knock on the door came moments later, signaling it was time. The ceremony itself was a blur. Lucas stood at the altar, looking impossibly handsome in his tailored black tuxedo, his jaw set and his expression unreadable. Charlotte noticed the way his eyes softened slightly when he saw her walking down the aisle, but she dismissed it as a trick of the moment. They exchanged vows under a canopy of roses, their words rehearsed and devoid of emotion. When Lucas slid the diamond-encrusted wedding band onto her finger, Charlotte felt the weight of it, both literal and metaphorical. The reception was a grand affair, filled with champagne toasts, a 5-tiered cake, and an endless parade of congratulatory handshakes and polite smiles. Lucas played his part perfectly, his arm resting lightly on Charlotte's waist as they moved through the crowd. To the outside world, they looked like the picture-perfect couple. Inside, Charlotte felt like she was suffocating. It wasn't until much later, after the last guest had departed and the mansion had grown quiet, that Charlotte found herself alone with Lucas in the suite they were now expected to share. She stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit gardens below, still in her wedding dress. Lucas loosened his tie, watching her from across the room. "You don't have to stay in here if you don't want to," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I can take one of the guest rooms." Charlotte turned to face him, her arms crossed. "Is that how this is going to work? Separate lives, separate rooms?" Lucas shrugged, his expression guarded. "That's what we agreed, isn't it?" "No pressure." She studied him for a moment, her chest tightening. "I don't want to live like strangers, Lucas. If we're going to do this, really do this, we need to try." "Try what?" he asked, his voice low. "To pretend this is real, to pretend we're something we're not." "No," she said, stepping closer. "To see if we can be more than just two people trapped in the same cage." Lucas stared at her, the tension between them thick and electric. Finally, he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll try." The days that followed were a delicate dance between them, each step tentative but deliberate. Lucas insisted Charlotte move into his penthouse in Manhattan, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city. It was sleek and modern, every detail meticulously designed, yet Charlotte felt like an intruder in a museum. One evening, Lucas surprised her by taking her to an art gallery downtown. It wasn't just any gallery, it was an exhibit for up-and-coming artists, the kind of place Charlotte had only dreamed of visiting. "I thought you might like this," Lucas said as they walked through the space, his hands in his pockets. He looked almost nervous, a side of him she hadn't seen before. Charlotte stopped in front of a painting, her eyes widening. It was bold and vibrant, the colors swirling together in a way that felt chaotic and alive. "This is incredible," she whispered. Lucas watched her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "So are you." She turned to him, startled, but he didn't look away. For a moment, the world seemed to fade, leaving just the two of them standing there, the air between them charged with something neither of them could name. Later that night, as they sat in a quiet corner of an upscale restaurant, Lucas handed her a small envelope. Charlotte opened it, her breath catching when she saw what was inside. A lease agreement for a studio space in the city, with her name listed as the tenant. "You've been saying you wanted to paint more," Lucas said, his voice steady. "Now you can." Charlotte blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Lucas, this is—" "I don't even know what to say." "Say you'll use it," he said simply. "Say you'll let yourself dream a little." She reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "Thank you," she said softly. "You don't know how much this means to me." Lucas held her gaze, and for the first time, Charlotte saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "I think I'm starting to." Their relationship continued to evolve, each day bringing them closer in ways neither of them had anticipated. Lucas began to open up about his past, sharing stories of his struggles to step out of his father's shadow and build his own success. Charlotte, in turn, shared more of her dreams and fears, finding a surprising sense of safety in Lucas's presence. But not everything was smooth. One evening, Charlotte overheard a phone call between Lucas and his father, the tension in his voice unmistakable. "I didn't marry her for the merger," Lucas said sharply. "And if you think I'm going to let you dictate how I live my life, you're sorely mistaken." When he hung up, Charlotte approached him cautiously. "Is everything all right?" Lucas looked at her, his jaw tight. "It's nothing. Just my father being himself." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding. "You don't have to deal with him alone, you know. We're in this together." Lucas's expression softened, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "Thank you," he murmured, "for reminding me that I'm not alone." In that moment, something shifted between them, a quiet understanding, an unspoken promise. They weren't just surviving this marriage anymore. They were building something real. One evening, Lucas surprised Charlotte with a rooftop dinner under the stars. The table was set with fine china. Candles flickered in the breeze, and the city lights stretched out below them like a sea of diamonds. "This is incredible," Charlotte said, her voice filled with wonder. Lucas took her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "You deserve incredible." As the night went on, Lucas found himself leaning closer, his heart pounding. "Charlotte," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd say this, but I think I'm falling for you." Charlotte's breath caught, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I think I'm falling for you too." And as their lips met for the first time, the world seemed to melt away, leaving just the two of them and the undeniable truth that they had found something they hadn't even known they were searching for: love. 2 months after their wedding, Lucas stood in the middle of Charlotte's art studio, his hand resting on the edge of a freshly painted canvas, a small smile playing on his lips. The studio was alive with color, the walls lined with her work pieces he had watched her bring to life over countless evenings. Charlotte was across the room, her hair tied loosely back, her hands smeared with paint as she worked on a new project. She didn't notice him at first, too lost in her world of swirling colors and bold strokes. "You ever stop?" he teased, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the space. Charlotte startled, turning to see him standing there, looking effortlessly handsome in his tailored charcoal suit. "Lucas," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "What are you doing here?" "Don't you have some high-stakes meeting or merger to run off to?" he shrugged, stepping closer. "Cancelled it," her eyebrows shot up. "You cancelled a meeting." "For what?" "For you," he said simply, his eyes locking on hers. Charlotte blinked, her heart skipping a beat. "Me?" Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, neatly folded piece of paper. "There's something I want to show you." "What is it?" she asked, wiping her hands on a rag before taking the paper from him. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the text. Her breath caught as she realized what it was: a formal invitation to an exclusive gallery event featuring her artwork. Her name was printed in bold letters at the top. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How did you—" "I made a few calls," he said, his tone casual but his eyes filled with something deeper. "Your work deserves to be seen, Charlotte. And this gallery, it's one of the best in the city. They were more than happy to feature you." Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched the invitation. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll go," he said, his voice softening. "Say you'll let the world see how incredible you are." Charlotte threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Lucas held her tightly, his hand gently stroking her back. "I think I do." The night of the gallery event arrived, and Lucas stood at the entrance, waiting for Charlotte. He had insisted on sending a driver to pick her up, wanting her to arrive in style. When she stepped out of the car, his breath caught. She wore a deep emerald green dress that hugged her figure perfectly, the color making her eyes shine even brighter. Her auburn hair was styled in soft waves, and she looked every bit the radiant artist she was. "You look stunning," Lucas said, his voice low as he offered her his arm. "And you look like you're about to close $1 billion deal," she teased, noticing his impeccably tailored black tuxedo. He chuckled, leading her inside. The gallery was buzzing with energy, filled with art enthusiasts and collectors. Charlotte's work was displayed prominently, each piece drawing admiration and praise. Lucas stayed by her side, watching as she spoke passionately about her art to anyone who approached her. He couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. At one point, a wealthy collector approached them, his interest in one of Charlotte's paintings clear. "This piece," the man said, pointing to a vibrant abstract work. "It's extraordinary. I'd like to purchase it." Charlotte hesitated, glancing at Lucas. He gave her an encouraging nod. "It's your decision," he said softly. She took a deep breath before turning back to the collector. "Thank you," she said with a smile. "I'd be honored." As the man walked away, Lucas leaned in close. "You're amazing, you know that?" Charlotte smiled up at him, her eyes glistening. "I'm starting to believe it." Later that evening, as the event began to wind down, Lucas took Charlotte's hand and led her to one of the quieter corners of the gallery. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his tone serious. "What is it?" she asked, her brow furrowing. Lucas hesitated, his usual confidence faltering for a moment. "I never thought I'd say this, but you've changed everything for me, Charlotte. When this marriage was forced on us, I thought it would be nothing but a burden. But now, I can't imagine my life without you." Her breath hitched, her heart pounding. "Lucas, I love you," he said, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "I love you more than I ever thought possible." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she reached up to cup his face. "I love you too," she whispered. "You've made me feel like I can do anything, Lucas. Like I'm finally free to be who I am." He leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a kiss that spoke of everything they had been through and everything they still had to come. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in their own little universe. In the weeks that followed, Lucas and Charlotte settled into a rhythm that felt natural and right. Their relationship had grown into something neither of them had expected but both of them cherished deeply. Lucas continued to support Charlotte's artistic dreams, and in turn, she became his grounding force, the one person who could see past his wealth and success to the man he truly was. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Lucas's penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle below, he turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "What's on your mind?" Charlotte asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice soft. "About how lucky I am to have you in my life." She smiled, reaching for his hand. "We're both lucky," she said. "We found something real in the middle of all this chaos." He kissed her forehead, pulling her closer. "I promise to love you every day, Charlotte. To show you, not just tell you. And I promise the same," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You're my partner in every way, Lucas. My best friend, my love." As they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, they knew they had found something rare and precious, a love that had grown against all odds, a love that would last a lifetime.